In 1843, a Scottish missionary named John Wilson stands before a crowd of Parsis in Bombay, holding up a Zoroastrian prayer book. He reads aloud, "I profess to be a worshipper of Mazda, one who praises and reveres the Amesha Spenta." Then he slams the book shut. You see, polytheists, you worship 7 gods, not one. Your faith is primitive, pagan, no different from the idol worshippers Christ condemned. The accusation lands like a hammer. For decades, Parsi scholars have been defending their religion as pure monotheism, the spiritual ancestor of Judaism and Christianity. Now this missionary is using their own scripture against them. Within a generation, Zoroastrian theologians will rewrite 15 centuries of their tradition's understanding of these 7 beings. They'll transform gods into metaphors, divine entities into moral abstractions. And that emergency theological edit, it'll become so entrenched that most modern Zoroastrians believe it was always the original teaching. But the Gathas, the hymns of Zoroaster himself, tell a different story. So do the stone reliefs of Sassanid Persia, where 7 crowned figures stand in Ahura Mazda's court. So does the Avestan language itself, which treats these beings as entities you can address, invoke, honor. The question isn't whether the Amesha Spenta were once considered divine. The question is, how did gods become abstractions, and why? The story begins in the Gathas, the oldest layer of Zoroastrian scripture, composed somewhere around 1500 to 1000 BCE. Zoroaster's hymns mention 6 entities by name: Vohumana, Ashavahishta, Kshatra Vairya, Spenta Armayati, Harvatat, and Amaritat. Good purpose, desirable dominion, holy devotion, immortality. The names sound like virtues, and they are, but they're also presences. In Yasna 31, Zoroaster describes Ahura Mazda creating the universe through thought, and these 6 emerge as the instruments of that creation. They're not just concepts Ahura Mazda embodies. They're the means through which he acts. And there's a 7th. Spenta Menu, the bounteous spirit, the holy mentality, appears in the Gathas as the active principle of Ahura Mazda's creative force. Later theology will struggle mightily with Spenta Menu's status. Is it another name for Ahura Mazda himself? An aspect of him? A separate entity? The Gathas don't resolve this cleanly, and that ambiguity will haunt Zoroastrian cosmology for millennia. What's clear is that Spenta Menu acts, chooses, speaks, creates in ways that suggest agency, not mere attribute. The term Amesha Spenta itself, immortal holy ones, doesn't appear in the Gathas. It shows up first in the Yasna Haptang Haiti, a liturgical text only slightly younger than Zoroaster's hymns, where it's reversed, Spenta Amesha, holy immortals. By the time we reach the younger Avesta composed over the following centuries, the term has crystallized into a technical designation. The 7. The Great Heptad, and their roles have become systematized in ways the Gathas only hint at. Each of the Amesha Spenta now guards a domain of creation. Vohumana protects cattle and all animals. Ashavahishta watches over fire and all luminaries. Kshatra Vairya governs metals. Spenta Armayati guards the earth itself. Harvatat oversees water. Amaritat tends plants. And Spenta Menu, or Ahura Mazda acting through Spenta Menu, stands as guardian of humanity. This isn't poetry, this is cosmological architecture. The Amesha Spenta aren't symbols of these elements. They're their custodians, their spiritual essence, their divine protectors. This creates something unique in ancient religion, a fusion of ethics and physics. When a Zoroastrian tends a flame, they're not just maintaining a useful tool. They're honoring Ashavahishta, truth itself, which manifests in all luminous things. When they irrigate a field, they're serving Harvatat, wholeness, whose domain is every drop of water. Virtue and matter are inseparable. The moral and the material are 2 faces of the same divine reality. The Bundahishan, an 11th century cosmological text, describes the mechanics. In the beginning, Ahura Mazda emanates the Amesha Spenta. Through them, he then creates the 7 foundational elements. The Amesha Spenta aren't created, They emanate, flowing out from the Creator like light from a flame. They're eternal, uncreated, sharing in Ahura Mazda's own immortality. And they're active. They fight. They choose. They have antagonists, because each Amesha Spenta has a dark opposite. Asha, truth, battles Druj, the lie. Vohu Mana, good purpose, wars against Aka Mana, evil purpose. Spenta Manu himself stands opposed to Angra Manu, the destructive spirit, the cosmic principle of decay and violence. This is dualism, but not the dualism of two equal gods. It's dualism within a monotheistic framework, one uncreated creator, one created destroyer, and six paired principles locked in struggle until the final renovation of the world. The universe itself is a battlefield, and the Amesha Spenta are generals in a war that runs through every atom. Now watch what happens in Sassanid Persia from the 3rd to 7th centuries CE. Zoroastrianism is the state religion of an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indus. Royal inscriptions invoke Ahura Mazda and the Amesha Spenta by name. Coins depict them as winged, crowned figures flanking the emperor. In rock reliefs at Naqshi Rustam, 7 divine attendants stand in Ahura Mazda's heavenly court, distinct individuals with iconographic attributes. These aren't glowing thought clouds hovering around a supreme deity. They're courtiers, ministers, archangels, in every sense that word will later carry in Christian angelology. The Avestan prayers Zoroastrians recite daily address the Amesha Spenta directly, by name, asking for their favor. May Asha Vahishta grant us strength. May Spenta our Maiti bless this earth. Fire temples across the empire keep flames burning continuously in honor of Asha Vahishta, not as symbols, but as living manifestations of the divine. Water from sacred springs carries Harvatat's presence. The prayers don't say, remember the virtue of truth. They say, honor Asha Vahishta, who is truth embodied, and there's a curious linguistic fossil embedded in their names. Amaritat, immortality, shares its root with Sanskrit amrita and Greek ambrosia, both meaning the food or drink of immortality. These are cognates, remnants of Proto-Indo-European en Mr. To, not dead. In the Rig Veda, the Vishvi Amrita are all the immortals, the collective term for divine beings. The Amesha Spenta occupy the exact same linguistic and conceptual space in Zoroastrianism that the Devas occupy in Vedic religion. Same structure. But Zoroaster performs a revolutionary inversion. His immortals aren't capricious nature spirits. They're ethical principles with cosmic scope. This is what makes the Amesha Spenta genuinely unprecedented. They're both gods and virtues, simultaneously and without contradiction. Modern religious categories: monotheism versus polytheism, immanent versus transcendent, abstract versus personal, don't have the vocabulary for this. The Amesha Spenta shatter those binaries. They're the scaffolding holding up a cosmos that's simultaneously material and spiritual, where every rock embodies justice and every flame radiates truth. Hold that in your mind as we jump to 19th century India. The Parsi community, Zoroastrians who fled to Gujarat after the Islamic conquest of Persia, has thrived under Mughal and then British rule. They're merchants, shipbuilders, industrialists. But they're also a minority, and Christian missionaries are circling. John Wilson arrives in Bombay in 1829. He's learned Gujarati and Avestan. He knows the prayers. And he's strategic. Wilson's argument is surgical. Look at your own scriptures. You revere the Amesha Spenta. You dedicate the first 7 days of every month to them. You represent them with physical objects on your altars, a metal tray for Kshatra, a water vessel for Harvatat. You're venerating multiple divine beings. That's not monotheism. That's polytheism with a supreme god bolted on top, no different from the Romans calling Jupiter greatest and best, while worshipping a whole pantheon. For Parsi intellectuals, this is an existential crisis. They've spent decades arguing that Zoroastrianism is the purest monotheism, that their tradition influenced Judaism during the Babylonian exile, that their faith is the spiritual superior of Hinduism's idol worship. Now their own liturgy is being used to undermine them. They need a defense. Fast, enter Martin Haug. German philologist, Sanskrit scholar, arrives in India in 1859 to teach at Pune College. The Parsi community commissions him to produce a definitive study of the Avesta. Haug is brilliant, meticulous, and he brings 19th-century European philosophical categories to Bronze Age Iranian poetry. In his 1862 Essays on the Sacred Language, Writings and Religion of the Parsis, he proposes a solution. Zoroaster himself, Haug argues, understood the Amesha Spenta as purely abstract qualities of Ahura Mazda. They were philosophical concepts. The later personification, all those prayers, rituals, iconography, was corruption. Decadent priests had turned Zoroaster's pure ethical monotheism into polytheism. It's a Protestant reading applied to Zoroastrianism, strip away the centuries of Catholic ritual accretion to recover the founder's original pristine message. And the Parsi reformists seize it with both hands. This is their shield against Wilson's attacks. We don't worship 7 gods. We honor 7 divine qualities. The Amesha Spenta are aspects of Ahura Mazda, not separate beings. Our tradition was always monotheistic. We just forgot that for a while. The reinterpretation spreads like wildfire. Parsi schools start teaching Haug's theory as fact. Theological texts get republished with new commentaries, explaining that all those prayers addressing the Amesha Spenta directly are actually meditations on Ahura Mazda's attributes. The physical representations in fire temples, those objects that embodied the guardians of creation, become reminders of abstract virtues. Within a generation, the revisionist interpretation becomes orthodox. Here's the remarkable part. It sticks. By the early 20th century, most Zoroastrians accept Haug's reading as the authentic, original teaching. Modern Parsi and Iranian Zoroastrian scholars teach it in universities. When Western academics study Zoroastrianism, they cite this continuing monotheism as definitive. The emergency theological maneuver becomes conventional wisdom, becomes historical fact. But the original sources never moved. The Gathas still address Vohu Mana directly. Through good purpose may we discern thee, O Mazda, not through the quality of good purpose, through Vohu Mana, named and invoked. The younger Avesta still calls Attar, fire, the most active of the Amesha Spenta, suggesting they're a category of being, not a list of attributes. The Bundahishn still describes their emanation from Ahura Mazda as a cosmological event, the first act of creation. The Sassanid inscriptions still name them as distinct entities receiving honor alongside the Creator. And there's a curious omission in the Gathic list that reveals how old these traditions are. Kshatra Variya, desirable dominion, governs metals in later texts. But in the Gathas, Kshatra has no clear elemental association. Why? Because when Zoroaster was composing these hymns, metals weren't part of cosmology. This is Stone Age theology. The sky is of the hardest stone in Zoroaster's revelation. It's a rock dome overhead. The 7 creations are stone, water, plants, animals, humans, fire, and sky. There's no bronze yet, no iron, no category for metal. As metallurgy advances, the stone sky becomes a problem. Bronze tools, iron weapons, these are clearly fundamental to the world. So Zoroastrian cosmology adapts. The stone firmament becomes a crystal dome. Crystal is both mineral and translucent, a bridge between stone and something finer. Then it becomes a metallic vault, the sphere of stars forged from divine metal. Kshatra inherits guardianship of this new creation. The theological tradition evolves to incorporate technological change. By the Sassanid period, Kshatra Variya is definitively the patron of metals, and metalworkers invoke him. But the Gathic blank space reveals the seam, the moment when the system expanded to include something new. This is religions as living systems. They metabolize new realities. The Amesha Spenta framework is flexible enough to absorb the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the astronomical insights of Babylonian science. It survives the Greek conquest, the Parthian dynasty, the Sassanid codification, the Islamic conquest, colonial missionary pressure, modern diaspora. At each stage, the 7 entities are reinterpreted, represented, re-understood. But they persist, and their fingerprints are everywhere in later traditions. In the book of Revelation, 7 spirits stand before God's throne, 7 torches of fire, 7 divine attributes made manifest. The image echoes Zoroastrian cosmology so precisely that scholars debate whether early Christians borrowed it directly or whether both traditions drew from a common wellspring. Jewish angelology after the Babylonian exile, when Judean elites lived under Persian rule, suddenly features named archangels with specific cosmic roles: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael. This is new. Earlier Hebrew texts have the angel of the Lord, generic messengers. Now they have Michael as guardian of Israel, Gabriel as herald, Raphael as healer. Specific beings with defined portfolios. The structure matches the Amesha Spenta model too cleanly to be coincidence. Islamic tradition preserves it differently. The Amesha Spenta become the Amahara Spandan in Persian Muslim cosmology, Zoroastrian angels folded into Islamic angelology. Some Sufi orders venerate them as saints. The 7 become 14, then 40, numbers shifting, but the principle intact, divine intermediaries governing aspects of creation, neither fully absorbed into God nor fully separate from Him. Modern fantasy fiction rediscovers the pattern independently. In Avatar, The Last Airbender, 4 nations correspond to 4 elements, each with benders who channel elemental power, and balance requires honoring all 4. That's Amesha Spenta logic, cosmic order depending on recognizing the sacred in matter. The Marvel Cinematic Universe's Infinity Stones, 6 physical objects embodying abstract principles: power, space, time, mind, reality, soul, and collecting all 6 grants control over creation. That's the heptad again, Zoroastrian cosmology refracted through comic books. The template endures because it solves a problem. How do you talk about a transcendent, infinite God who nevertheless acts in a finite, material world? The Amesha Spenta are the answers Zoroastrianism offers. They're emanations, neither fully identical with Ahura Mazda nor separate from him. They're his thought, his will, his creative force, made manifest in specific domains. Through them, the infinite touches the finite without contradiction. This is why the monotheism versus polytheism debate misses the point. Those categories are Greek, products of Platonic philosophy that divides reality into form and matter, ideal and real. Zoroastrianism predates that split. In its cosmology, there's no daylight between the ethical and the physical. Truth isn't an abstract form that fire symbolizes. Truth is what fire is at its essence. The flame on the altar is Asha Vahishta's body in the world. To honor it is to honor truth itself. When Christian missionaries called this polytheism, they were reading Zoroastrianism through Nicene Christianity's metaphysics, where Christ is of one substance with the Father, a single divine ousia, one being in 3 persons. The Trinity is monotheism because the 3 are metaphysically one. But apply that same logic to the Amesha Spenta, and you get a different result. 7 emanations from one source, each with distinct identity but sharing the Creator's immortal nature. Is that 7 gods? One God with 7 aspects? The question assumes a binary that Zoroastrianism never accepted. The modern Parsi reinterpretation, Amesha Spenta as abstractions, tries to resolve this by flattening the divine hierarchy. There's only Ahura Mazda, and humans meditate on 7 of his qualities. Problem solved, monotheism preserved. But that solution comes at a cost. It erases the cosmological drama. There's no longer a war in heaven. Angramanyu isn't battling Spentamanyu across creation. Evil is just absence of good, a philosophical problem rather than a cosmic conflict. The Amesha Spenta aren't guardians actively sustaining the world. They're virtues humans should emulate. The universe stops being a battlefield and becomes a classroom. And it severs the link between matter and spirit that made Zoroastrianism revolutionary. If the Amesha Spenta are just mental concepts, then fire is just fire, a useful tool, perhaps sacred as a reminder, but not divine. The ethical imperative to tend the flame, irrigate the field, honor the earth becomes environmentalism by metaphor rather than theology by structure. The world is no longer charged with the grandeur of the divine in every atom. It's just the stage where humans work out their salvation. The historical irony cuts deep. Zoroastrianism was accused of polytheism for venerating creation, So modern Zoroastrians de-divined creation to prove their monotheism. But the original theology had already solved the problem. The Amesha Spenta aren't other gods. They're how the one God is present everywhere. They're the mechanism of immanence. Hogg and the 19th century reformers didn't recover primitive monotheism. They invented it, projecting Protestant assumptions onto a tradition that had always thought in different categories. Today, this matters beyond academic theology. Every tradition that talks about angels, emanations, cosmic hierarchy, divine intermediaries, is wrestling with the same question: how does the infinite relate to the finite? How is God here without being just another thing in the world? The Amesha Spenta offered one answer: simultaneously transcendent and immanent, virtue and being, one in seven, and that answer shaped half the globe's religious imagination, from Jewish angelology to Islamic cosmology to Christian iconography. In fire temples across India and Iran, Zoroastrians still perform the yasna ceremony. On the altar, a metal tray, a water vessel, a flowering branch. Kshatra, Harvatat, Amaritat. When the priest says their names, is he invoking abstract qualities or greeting presences? The modern catechism says the former. The ritual structure, offering, invocation, petition, suggests the latter. And maybe that tension is the point, because what John Wilson and Martin Hogg both missed is that religious language works differently than philosophical propositions. When a Zoroastrian says, "I revere the Amesha Spenta," they're not making a metaphysical claim about how many deities exist. They're positioning themselves in a cosmos structured by goodness, a universe where truth is not just an idea but a force, where devotion sustains the world, where mortality struggles toward wholeness and immortality. The 7 names are a map. How you walk the territory, whether you meet gods or virtues along the way, might depend less on doctrine than on how you tend your fire, irrigate your field, speak your truth. The Gathas offer one final clue. In Yasna 47, Zoroaster asks Ahura Mazda directly, "Who among mortals is the friend of truth?" And the hymn answers, "The one who lives by good purpose, who through justice brings dominion, who by holy devotion seeks wholeness and immortality." The Amesha Spenta aren't other beings you worship instead of God. They're the path. They're how finite creatures approach the infinite, through truth, purpose, devotion, wholeness. They're steps in a ladder and presences on the road and qualities in the soul all at once, without contradiction. That's what got lost in the colonial scramble to prove respectability. Not polytheism or monotheism, but the older, stranger idea that the material world isn't separate from the spiritual realm, that when you honor water, you're honoring wholeness itself. And that's honoring the Creator who emanated wholeness into every spring and river. That's dangerous theology. It means you can't despoil the earth without despoiling the divine. It means ethics and physics are 2 names for the same law. The Amesha Spenta sit at the altar in every fire temple, represented now by objects rather than icons, abstractions rather than entities. But the objects are still there. The names are still recited. The 7 days of the month still bear their titles. And somewhere in that gap between what's officially taught and what's ritually performed, the original vision flickers, 7 crowned figures in a court of light, neither God nor not God, the immortal holy ones through whom creation breathes.